The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
The crimes of so-called governments are all too often in direct proportion to the expansiveness of their power, something we should all consider deeply. And a quote from Edmund Burke to consider as well. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. How many fit that category? That needs to change soon. How long will Americans and other first world populations around the world remain completely oblivious to the completely altered skies that we all now live under? Skies laden with the now almost constant jet aircraft spraying of spreading, expanding, climate engineering particulate trails. Particulates of heavy metals and chemicals which are all settling down through the breathable air column where each of us, every one of us, is inhaling them. Welcome to the new world. This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org Radio, weekly edition of Global Alert News for March 4th, 2017. As always, this is a commercial-free news hour paid for by GeoEngineeringWatch.org. This show is broadcast on KQMS throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Recordings of this show can be found on GeoEngineering Watch and KQMS at GeoEngineeringWatch.org under the top stories, recent, and radio columns. Orchard Nutrition, if you live in Shasta County or Redding, we still are stocking, as long as we can, free materials to help you understand what's going on in your world that mainstream media is not telling you about. Our local media in Northern California, most especially, the Record Searchlight and KRCR. And in the case of the Record Searchlight, our local Northern California newspaper, who has stated emphatically on the record, for example, that they will not cover the climate engineering issue, period, by their own editor. Is that the kind of news you want on the biggest untold story on the planet today? That our local media, like the rest of corporate media, refuses to address the truth because their paychecks and pensions depend on them not addressing it? So stop by Orchard. If you grab one of the free DVDs there on vaccinations or climate engineering or 9/11 information, please simply share it and make the most of it. For those that need to wake up on the vaccination issue, you can go online and watch Vaxxed for $2 or $3. Isn't the health of your child worth $2 or $3? I think it's $3.99, something like that. The Vaxxed people are doing everything they can around the globe to disclose the fact that we have top CDC scientists trying to share data with Congress that proves the CDC has been hiding known vaccination dangers for decades. A story on that coming up in a moment. Final announcement, the next free public film screening in Redding at the Redding Library will be on March 25th, 2:30 p.m. We'll announce the next documentary in the coming weeks. I should have that for next week. We just want to pick the most compelling, most profound documentary to help wake the population up to the walls that are closing in around us all. On to headlines, lots to cover. This source from EcoWatch, important on the vaccination issue, yet more data surfacing as to just how lethal vaccinations are. Here's the headline. Metal debris found in vaccine supply. A landmark new study has found metal debris and biological contamination in every human vaccine tested. The study should have profound and immediate impact on public health policies and vaccine industry procedures around the globe. A team of scientists used a highly sensitive technology, an environmental scanning electron microscope equipped with an X-ray microbe to scan for solid contaminants in 44 samples of 30 vaccinations. The researchers reported their results in the International Journal of Vaccines and Vaccination. They found widespread contamination by toxic aluminum salts, red blood cells of unknown origin, and inorganic foreign particle debris in aggregates, clusters, and independent particles. Is this what you want injected into your veins or your children's veins? Something to think about. The report continues. The composition of those clusters, the researchers observe, are consistent with, quote, burnt waste. What is that? encourage everybody to find this report online and read it. Further analysis of those particles revealed them to be non-biocompatible and biopersistent foreign bodies, composed of lead, stainless steel, chromium, tungsten, nickel, iron, zirconium, hafnium, strontium, antimony, and other metals. The investigators also identified some particulates embedded in biological substrate, probably proteins, endotoxins, and residues of bacteria. The researchers found contamination in 43 of the 44 vaccine samples tested. The authors stated that these contaminants should not be persistent in any vaccine and that their presence was not declared by the manufacturers. And ironically, and listen to this, the one sample of the 44 tested that came back clean was a veterinary vaccine. Imagine that. On with more headlines. Superbug infections rising rapidly and spreading silently in our children. Any connection with the vaccine study just done? When will people connect the dots and understand that the medical industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industrial complex is not invested in our health ultimately? They are not. And if our medical industry, our medical practitioners, who I know perform good work in many areas, surgeries, certain procedures that need to be done, I'm not saying that there's no merit for Western medicine, but we have a whole community of Western medicine practitioners that refuse to look at facts and data, that are apparently determined to continue with practices that are harming our children and ourselves. That's inexcusable. When will the public hold them accountable? Another headline, signs of drug resistance found in new bird flu strain after H7N9 kills 94 in China this year. We don't know what type of biological warfare is going on constantly around the globe. We have outbreaks everywhere, species die-off happening everywhere. Encourage everyone to look up mass animal deaths 2017, and there's a list for 2015 or 2016, 2015 on down the line. Shocking how many mass die-offs are happening every single day around the world. Another headline from Phoenix New Times, plan a protest, lose your house. Arizona Senate passes SB 1142 charging, quote, provocateurs with racketeering. These are signs of an incredibly desperate power structure that wants to tighten the noose around the public's neck as fast as they can before the public fully awakens to exactly what's been done to them on countless levels, from vaccinations to climate engineering to GMO food to a long list of other issues. Where would we even stop? The public has to wake up to what's happening to them. From this report on the Arizona legislation, the Arizona Senate passed a bill on Wednesday that would allow the government to seize the property of people who help plan a demonstration that turns violent. If the bill becomes law, prosecutors could charge people and seize assets for conspiracy to riot, even if the so-called conspirators did not participate in any way in any form of violence. So think about that. If you plan a peaceful protest and someone plants a provocateur there to cause some sort of problem that you had nothing to do with, they want to pass a bill to be able to seize your home and property? This is a police state, period, and that's where we're heading. More headlines about a primary U.S. ally, an ally that seems to escape any sort of punishment no matter what they do. From the 93 Saudis that were flown back after 9/11, not that we think that they necessarily had anything to do with 9/11, because clearly that was a false flag event, but they were given a free pass to go back to Saudi Arabia. No interviews, no interrogations, nothing. To the recent Trump travel ban list that also didn't include Saudi Arabia. They're immune from any sort of punishment because they have the oil. And as I covered last week, the petrodollar, the U.S. can't afford to have Saudi Arabia trade oil at anything other than dollars. So the U.S. looks the other way no matter what Saudi does. So here's the headline about Saudi Arabian sexual slavery. This is from the Express in the UK. Quote, here's the headline: Islamic State selling sex slaves to wealthy clients from Saudi Arabia and Turkey. From that report, Islamic State thugs are running sick sex slave markets where the best-looking girls are reserved for the wealthy clients from Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Are we invading Saudi Arabia to try to bring them freedom and democracy? Of course not, for all the reasons I've already cited. Total hypocrisy. So when you're waving your flag and pretending your country is doing the right thing all over the globe, find out exactly what's going on in the world before you come to conclusions. About Mr. Trump, the picture continues to grow ever more alarming. And I suffered through the theater of Trump's speech this week. And with the exception of honoring some that died in the course of duty, which I'm all for, they should be honored. But what a shocking display of manufactured theater and blatant falsehoods that the rest of this speech contained. And before I get to information that most Trump supporters don't want to hear, to criticize Mr. Trump is in no way to support the Clinton crime cabal, or the Bushes, or the Obamas, or the Clintons, or any of the rest. All those involved in those levels of government are criminals in one way or another, and they all behave in manners that deserve immense amount of criticism, and ultimately it's all theater, isn't it? When will Americans stop falling for this left-right division paradigm? Both sides have plenty of blame to bear. Both sides. Both sides are operating from ideology, preconception, tribalism. That has to change. We must unite in a common cause of exposing those in power who are not there for our best interest or the interest of the planet, the interest of our children's future. So in regard to Mr. Trump and the actions he has already taken since occupying the White House, here's a headline from multiple news sources. This headline should be considered. This report should be sought out and read by all in its entirety. Here's an excerpt. Here's the headline. How the Trump regime was manufactured by a war inside the deep state. Continuing from this report, a systemic crisis in the global deep system has driven the violent radicalization of a deep state faction. Continuing from this report, rather than being a nationalist insurgency against the corporate globalist deep state, the Trump regime represents a nationalist coup by a disgruntled cross-section within the deep state itself. Rather than coming into conflict with the deep state, we are seeing a powerful military corporate nexus within the American deep state come to the forefront. Trump, in this context, is a tool to reorganize and restructure the deep state in reaction to what appears to be an escalating crisis in the global deep state shadow government system. What does that mean? It means that like mafia families that no longer have enough to go around, infighting begins. And that's what's happening. Does that mean any one of those mafia families is necessarily good? Of course not. And as I stated in last week's show, when we know we have a voting system that is rigged, that was acknowledged by all, especially in the Trump camp, until he won the election. And suddenly, it's all legitimate. This is part of the convincing drama. If those in power did not want Mr. Trump to win, I would argue he would not have won. And not that Mrs. Clinton would have been a leap in the right direction. That's a leap off the cliff as well. But if you're standing on a ridge and leaping left or leaping right, both lead to the cliff, is either choice a good choice? I would argue no. And Mr. Trump's actions make clear where his interests lie, in the military-industrial fossil fuel complex. Why is that so difficult for people to accept? Because so many people in our society have been trained to look for some individual to save them from themselves, from what society is participating in, someone to somehow magically fix everything, and that's not reality. And every actor in this play that's put forward by the power structure is simply that, an actor in the play. To keep the drama going, to make it look convincing, all the while to carry out business as usual, and that's exactly what we see happening. On that note, from the New York Times, Trump to ask for sharp increases in military spending, officials say. From Washington, President Trump will instruct federal agencies on Monday to assemble a budget for the coming fiscal year that includes sharp increases in Defense Department spending. Mr. Trump will demand a budget with tens of billions of dollars in reduction to the Environmental Protection Agency at the same time. What's new about this process? Gut the environment and pump up the military-industrial complex even more. And are these the actions of a sane species that takes into account the biosphere on which their lives depend is imploding by the day, and yet all they want to do is build ever more weapons of mass destruction? There's not that much left to destroy. And yet this is what we have. An increase in the U.S. military budget. The increase alone is as much as Russia's entire military budget. Now our military will be more funded than the next 10 militaries on the planet combined. And back to what I stated at the beginning of this episode. The corruption in power structures is directly proportionate to the expanse of their empire, their strength. Something to consider. Another headline from multiple sources. U.S. setting up ballistic missile systems on the Korean Peninsula. Again, I would state this. Who is in whose backyard all over the globe setting up provisions to start World War III as the environment implodes and those in power know it's coming? They know it's happening. They know they can't hide it much longer. So they are setting up, providing for the launching of global conflict again, which is the only card they have left to play. And this is our country doing this in our name. And if you're an American and you support this because you want to continue driving your SUV or living in your McMansion or consuming more than your fair share, is that right? Is it justifiable? And I know these are harsh truths, and I know me stating this on radio, on air, on the record is not popular. It doesn't make me popular, but I'm not here for popularity. I'm here to try to tell the truth. And we can accept the truth well, or we can accept it poorly. But we will accept it one way or the other, because there's no hiding from the truth forever. And the truth is, we, as a species, are consuming more than it would take 5 planets to provide. And no population consumes more per capita than the American population. And to think this could continue is utter and total delusion. And to support a military that is fueling what may be the last conflict on planet Earth, what would be, I would argue, certainly, in order to continue acquiring those resources, to continue business as usual until there's absolutely nothing left. Is that patriotism to support that? Is that showing a true concern for our children's future, to try to keep the party going till the last possible second at the cost of ensuring there will be nothing left to salvage? That's not patriotism. That's not love of our children. That's not regard for the thriving planet which we were given to try to be good stewards of. No, none of those things. That's simply blatant, selfish irresponsibility. We need to break that kind of a cycle if we're going to have anything left to salvage. So to reiterate, U.S. military bases all over the world, in countries all over the world, 156 of them now setting up missiles next to China, next to Russia. If any of these countries were doing that to us, Americans would never stand for it. Enough of the hypocrisy. It's time to hold our government accountable, and quite frankly, Mr. Trump is not doing that. He's simply doing what's always been done to further fuel the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned us about so long ago. So how does the military-industrial media complex galvanize the U.S. population into accepting ever greater militarization while the Earth's life support systems continue to implode by the day? By creating carefully spun headlines that have no basis in truth or reality whatsoever. And here's an example of that from last week. From multiple major news sources, here's the headline. Quote, Cold War. Russia calls for new world order as NATO sends troops to the Baltics and Poland. So let's make it seem as if someone else is the aggressor so that we can justify setting up our missiles on their borders. Let me read from this story and try to see through the spin on this. From this report, Russia wants global leaders to embrace a new world order where the U.S. and other Western nations are not calling the shots. Who gives us the right to call the shots anyway? Let's think about that. The report continues. But rather, sovereign nations will follow international law based on its national interests. That's a novel thought. Countries following international law, including the United States and other countries? Not happening right now. Moscow was seeking closer ties with Washington while also refusing to cower to the NATO militant alliance led by the U.S. NATO is crowding up against everyone else's borders. That's what NATO is meant to do, to help expand total Western power hegemonic control over the world and other countries. So, what did the Russian foreign minister actually say that was then spun into the headline that I just read? Here's what he said. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said, quote, "Responsible leaders should make a choice. I hope that the choice will be done in favor of creating a democratic and just world order." Anything wrong with that? Does anybody find any fault in that? He continues by saying this. If you want, you can call it a post-West world order when each country, based on its sovereignty, within the rules of international law, will strive to find a balance between its own national interests and the national interests of partners. Is there anything wrong with anything I just read? Not rationally, not logically, but for the U.S. military, media, corporate industrial complex, there's a lot wrong with this because they can only accept their own total hegemonic power over the world. And any sort of equitable arrangement between countries is unacceptable to the U.S. military-industrial complex. Completely unacceptable. And that's the world we live in, and that's the world that U.S. citizens have currently supported, and that's the trajectory that we are now on, which is leading us to total planetary omnicide and likely World War III soon. Learn to look through the headlines. Connect the dots with actual facts and not spun, hyped headlines from the power structure-owned media industrial complex. Learn to look through the smoke and mirrors. Another headline from last week. This one was authored by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, again, a former cabinet member for President Ronald Reagan. This report is titled The Resurrection of Armageddon. From Dr. Roberts, he states this: the U.S. intelligence community's extraordinary campaign of leaks claiming improper ties between President Trump's team and Russia seeks to ensure a lucrative Cold War by blocking detente. Now let's look through this headline as well. Because many people voted for Mr. Trump because they felt he would help to avoid World War III. But is that really the case? Are his actions really reflecting that underlying motive? Certainly we have a media system that's trying to expose these sort of connections with Russia, but is this all a part of the play? Is Trump all a part of the play? Whether he knows he is or not is irrelevant. Is he not playing right into what suits the military-industrial complex? Pump up the military, extraordinary increases in military spending, an already unbelievably bloated and out-of-control U.S. military, and then the corporate media tries to paint the picture that the Trump team is friendly with Russia. Do we think Russia really wants the U.S. military to increase its spending, to put missiles on their borders, pushing us ever closer to World War III? I'm simply asking us for all to be a little bit more discerning. Are Trump's supposed ties with Russia real? Or is that some sort of illusion or con? How can we know? How can we know what part Mr. Trump is playing in the overall picture unless we look at his actions and look at where those actions are leading? The complete gutting of environmental protection on every front and massive increases in military spending and U.S. operations all over the globe. Military operations, war games on the borders of other countries. Is that really the actions of someone who wants to avoid global conflict? I simply think we need to look through the smoke and mirrors no matter where the headlines come from. We need to connect all the dots to have a complete picture and to come to any sort of credible conclusion. Another headline on the gutting of environmental spending. From multiple sources, Donald Trump plans to cut spending on EPA climate change program by 70%. So many people in the anti-climate engineering movement falsely believe that Mr. Trump would somehow come into office and the aerosol operations in our skies would immediately halt. And why would we believe that? When we're talking about someone who's heavily invested in the fossil fuel industrial complex that is joined at the hip with the military industrial complex that is joined at the hip with the geoengineering industrial complex. Why would we believe Mr. Trump would stop that business as usual? Another headline from multiple sources as well. EPA halts inquiry into oil and gas industry emissions of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. Methane is not just a powerful greenhouse gas. Methane is the potential linchpin in our collective coffins because over a 10-year time horizon, it is from 100 to 120 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. Methane is spewing from fossil fuel industry installations all over the globe, filling our atmosphere and covering our planet like a layer of glass. And now all sort of regulation in that industry is going to be rolled back heavily. From this report, industry officials were quick to applaud Thursday's action. No surprise, is it? Quote, the exercise imposed significant costs on companies to produce additional paperwork and added unnecessary burdens on producers. We just don't want to go to any trouble that might hurt our profit margins, so we should have the right to pollute the planet and the atmosphere in any way we want. Does that sound like it's for the common good? And if that's the direction Mr. Trump's administration is going, is that not business as usual? And when the climate engineering operations are designed to keep the American population divided and confused as to the true damage done to the climate so that that damage can continue unabated, does this not all fit together? We should get over our biases, our preconceptions, and our delusions and start looking at reality. We must, all of us. Another headline. Quote, Shell knew. Oil giant's 1991 film warned of climate change danger. Yet more fortification of the theme that I'm currently discussing. The fossil fuel industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the climate engineering complex, all connected at the hip. From that report, a public information film unseen for years shows Shell had a clear grasp of global warming 26 years ago but has not acted accordingly. Let's go back further to editions of Popular Science that I published from the 50s. I have original copies of those publications in my possession that fully recognize the damage already done to the climate by the 1950s. The military-industrial complex recognized what was happening much earlier still. That's why massive climate engineering operations were deployed in the mid-1940s. Another headline from oilprice.com. This is the number one source of oil and energy news. The beginning of the end for the Bakken shale. Many know where the fracking is occurring in these shale deposits. Quote from that report, the decline of the Bakken oil production that started in January 2015 is probably not reversible. The new well performances have deteriorated dramatically. Gas oil ratios have increased and water cuts are rising. Much of the reservoir energy from the gas expansion is depleted and decline rates are accelerating rapidly. All illusions. The whole fracking fiasco, if you will, trashing the environment, polluting water sources, causing earthquakes, and now the production is falling off a cliff. Thus, the U.S. cowing down to tyrannical nations like Saudi Arabia will continue because of oil. That's why, oil and the petrodollar. So what's happening in the environment overall? Let's get to some headlines there, and there's going to be a lot more of these coming in the weeks and months ahead of us. Wait and see. From EcoWatch, 736 record highs set this week alone, as in last week. Nearly 3,000 daily maximum high-temperature records were set during the first half of the month. During the past week, 736 record highs were set, as I stated in the headline, with no record lows recorded. None. Zero. Thursday at the Falcon Dam in Texas recorded another record high temperature, this time of 107 degrees. The highest temperature ever recorded in the U.S. in February. Temperatures are going off the scale. And back to everything I've stated so far in this show, the power structure, the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel industry, all connected at the core, have all known this was coming for a very, very long time. And everything they have done was in the attempt to keep business as usual, hide the problem until the last possible moment while continuing to grind up the planet and its resources to increase their power and control over populations all over the globe. Another headline from Bloomberg. Record warmth could turn into a disaster for U.S. fruit growers. Most people have never stopped to consider the balance in nature that is necessary for nature to survive. Nature is resilient, yes, but what we have done to the planet in an overall context is unimaginably destructive from countless directions. Huge populations in first world societies, especially living in urban areas, have lost all connection to the natural world. Not only do they not see what's happening in the skies directly above their heads, they certainly don't see and are certainly not aware of what's happening in the environment overall. I live in the middle of a wilderness area, completely off-grid, and the decline I have seen in the forest in Northern California in the last decade plus is truly astounding. There are no closed canopies. You can see right through the forest, right to the sky, because the trees are ghosts. There's very little left of them, even those that survive now. We have a rapidly imploding boreal forests all over the globe. But so many in these urban areas have no idea this is happening. And I and others that are immersed in these environments and trying to sound the alarm are being ignored, because for those in urban areas, McDonald's is still selling Big Macs, Walmart's still open, and life seems normal until it's not, until the brick hits you between the eyes as the environment implodes and the power structure plays some very big cards, because they can't hide the fact that the planet's life support systems are failing. Continuing from this Bloomberg report about the record warmth, as of Wednesday, 6,096 new daily high temperature records were set over the last 30 days in the U.S., according to the National Centers for Environmental Information in Asheville, North Carolina. In addition, there were 5,174 record warm low temperatures as well. And that's very important. As methane fills the atmosphere, combining with CO2 already in the atmosphere, covering the atmosphere like a layer of glass, nighttime low temperatures are overall, on a long-term scale, rising twice as fast as daytime highs. It doesn't cool off at night because of the build-up blanket on the planet. This is happening at rapid pace, and climate engineering is making it far worse, not better. Why should this be a surprise? When you cover the planet with a layer of metal particulates that may reflect some sun during the daytime as it shreds the ozone layer, disrupts the hydrological cycle, and poisons the entire planet, but it also traps heat at night. This is the epitome of human insanity. Climate engineering is the absolute epitome of human insanity. Continuing from this report, in stark contrast, over the same period that was just mentioned over the last 30 days, 350 cold records were set. And those cool downs are completely engineered with chemical ice nucleating elements. If you don't know what that is or about how chemical engineered winters can be carried out, please research that subject online with articles from GeoEngineeringWatch.org. Continuing from this report, all-time highs for February were set in Boston, Milwaukee, Columbus, Ohio, Birmingham, New York, where readings reached into the 70s. The records that were broken were not just daily records, but monthly records. Continuing on along this theme, a headline from Down Under. This one is covered by ABC News. Canberra, Australia experiences hottest summer on record for daytime temperatures. It's not just in the U.S. And for those that are in the western U.S., the Pacific Northwest, that have had a significant amount of precipitation and not so warm weather this year, look past your own window sill. Look at some global data, because the reverse has been true in recent years in the U.S., has it not? While we had record snow in Boston, the U.S., the western U.S., California in particular, baked and fried. And too many people don't stop to consider that the climate engineers control the spigot. Now that it's raining in California, people ask, well, how could the geoengineers be doing anything because now it's raining? That's what climate engineering is. It's controlling the spigot. And whatever their agenda, whatever their motives, and however the weather conditions now are connected to other scenarios around the globe, because the system is very complex. What happens in California and what the geoengineers do in California can affect what's going on in the Arctic. And this experiment that is global climate engineering is in a constant state of flux, perpetual flux, a giant, ongoing, unimaginably destructive and toxic experiment of which we are all a part without our knowledge or consent. So just because they're fire hosing moisture into California, creating chemically engineered cool downs when the temperature goes from 70 degrees to snow in a day, or when it's snowing at 45 degrees, as I mentioned earlier in this program, that's simply an attempt to hide reality for as long as possible. And too many people in our society don't want reality, whether it's about Donald Trump or what's happening above their heads or the state of the imploding biosphere. They simply don't want reality. That's the purpose of this show, is to try to deliver some harsh reality. And if we don't face these realities, we'll have nothing less to salvage. I'll get more to that subject in a moment. I want to cover a few more headlines first. From CNBC News, Antarctica hits record high temperature at balmy 63.5 degrees Fahrenheit. We have places in Antarctica that are 80 degrees above normal. 80 degrees. Do we hear about that from the paid disinformation people at the Weather Channel? No, we don't hear about that. Weather Channel, Weather Central, which is owned by the Rothschilds. We have Climate Corp owned by Monsanto. We have the power structure controlling the message at every level in order to cover the tracks of the climate engineers. We have paid disinformation, quote-unquote, meteorologists whose job it is to try to explain away why it's snowing at 45 degrees, why we have weather whiplash going on all over the globe. And for these people, again, I know I hammer them a lot because I can't fathom how individuals like those at the Weather Channel and other paid disinformation weather sources can look themselves in the mirror. I can't imagine. And they lost one of their own, as I've stated in previous shows. Someone who was probably the type that would have spoken out. Their main modeling person at the Weather Channel was suicided in the Weather Channel parking garage. Many people don't know that if you haven't heard it on one of my shows in the past. And the shot across the bow of the rest that work at the Weather Channel, perhaps that's what they needed to continue in this pushing of falsehoods to try to cover the climate engineers' ongoing activities, if you will. Another headline from Antarctica. This is from ScienceAlert.com. Giant ice crack is forcing the evacuation of the Haley Antarctic Research Station. From that report, scientists are being forced to evacuate the Haley 6 research station in East Antarctica after a huge crack in the ice nearly doubled in length. The move comes only weeks after the facility began relocating in response to another threat, a huge chasm opening to the south, which threatened to cut the station off from the rest of the shelf and cast it adrift. Many people might mistake this with the giant crack they have heard about on the Larsen Sea Shelf in Antarctica. That's a different issue entirely. So we have much of the Antarctic ice shelf breaking apart. An ice chunk 6,500 square kilometers is about to break off of Larsen Sea. But this story that evacuated the British research station is new, another massive chunk breaking off. And what's more important than the ice breaking off itself is the fact that this is the cleat that holds back the land-based ice, which will then start to flow much faster into the ocean. We have looked at photographs this morning of sea level rise in places in Florida where people have the ocean now spreading onto their lawns in some places. This is actually photographed from just high tides. So it's here. It's not off on the horizon. It's here. These scenarios are real and ongoing. More headlines. From thehill.com, a publication, the headline, the highlights of those who claim to care about the climate and the environment. I want to highlight this. Sanders and Bill Nye to host climate change conversation. Bernie Sanders and Bill Nye will never say anything about climate engineering, which makes them unimaginable hypocrites to claim to care about the environment and yet to never mention the single greatest environmental assault of all, climate engineering, is just part of the entire environmental community that, I'm sorry, and I know this offends many in that community, but if you're in the environmental community and you're not addressing climate engineering, you're behaving with unimaginable hypocrisy. You can't have a legitimate discussion about the climate without discussing climate engineering first, climate engineering / intervention, which is nothing more than continued climate destruction and decimation. Climate engineering is not mitigating our warming planet, it is worsening it overall. Short-term engineered toxic cool downs at the cost of an even worsened overall warming and a completely contaminated planet. Again, if you're in the environmental community or you're in the global warming community and you're not discussing climate engineering, you're behaving with unimaginable hypocrisy. Another headline from Scientific American. Human activity will heat Alaska skies deliberately and picturesquely. Is it picturesque to see massive microwave transmissions completely disrupting the atmosphere? And they paint this as if it's some sort of scenic opportunity. From that report, this week, powerful radio waves will disturb the ionosphere to probe satellite disruptions and create strange glows. That's just what we're told. Let's keep that in mind. The military could not quite let go of HAARP altogether. We covered this at geoengineeringwatch.org when all the headlines came out stating the, quote, conspiracy theories were wrong because, look, they're taking HAARP down. We said it would never happen. It never happened. Not only did they not take it down, they've increased the funding, they've upgraded the facility, and they're using it as much as ever. The report continues. The Naval Research Laboratory thinks it can use the ionosphere heater to improve spy satellite operations. The lab will be running an experiment where it bounces radio signals off the ionosphere and then back down to the sea. Sound familiar? Remember the Fukushima event that I mentioned over and over, where MIT noted very extreme anomalous heating of the atmosphere directly above the Japanese quake epicenter? Remember that? And now it's covered from Scientific American. Exactly what they're doing with the ionosphere heaters. Final statement from this report. The success of these initial experiments will be critical in demonstrating the long-term viability of HAARP to the agencies funding the efforts along with the Navy, the National Science Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Energy. Now, these are agencies all involved with the collective insanity. Those who work for these agencies are participating in the collective insanity. Anybody in any form of employment or military commitment that is participating in this kind of insanity is literally ensuring that none of us have any future at all. And that's a mathematical fact. Final statement from this report. Listen to this closely. This is a quote. The beauty of HAARP is that it's a way to turn the ionosphere into a plasma lab where we can control the knobs and the timing. How wonderful. As if they have the right to experiment with Earth's life support systems and make light of it. That's the world we live in. If you're participating in that, you're a part of the cancer. I want to go over some summary here and a little bit of a rant. Forgive me, but we are on the fast track to near-term omnicide. Completely out of control climate engineering continues to decimate the planet's life support systems. The highly toxic heavy metal and chemical fallout from the constant atmospheric spraying from jet aircraft continues to contaminate every single breath we take. The power structure paid for disinformation sources like those I mentioned earlier, the Weather Channel, for example, have whole segments of their shows devoted to convincing populations that all their breathing difficulties, for example, and respiratory infections are just the result of pollen. This is a blatant lie that's intended to lull populations back to sleep while the systematic poisoning of the planet by climate engineering continues unabated. Weather Channel had a whole segment on that today. And we now have allergies year-round. We all know that because they're spraying year-round, and our respiratory systems are so incredibly inflamed from the constant exposure to these particulates that all year is, quote, allergy season. That's why every other commercial on the Weather Channel is either an allergy medicine or a military recruiting commercial. In the past 2 weeks, dozens of locations have gone from record high temperatures to snow in less than a day. The weather makers are using patented processes of chemical ice nucleation in order to engineer highly toxic cool downs wherever they have enough moisture to do so. A week ago, as I stated earlier, snowing at my home in the wilderness on the east side of Lake Shasta, 45 degrees. Chemical ice nucleation is why. And in fact, some of this chemically nucleated snow sat on the ground for days without melting, even though the temperatures during those days got as high as the low 60s and never went below 40 degrees. Welcome to engineered winter. Forgive me if I continue with the rant, but we live in a society in which countless individuals are not in any way interested in doing the right thing. Why? Because they're completely invested in doing the wrong thing. They're completely invested in agencies and corporations that they serve. Completely invested in those who supply their paychecks and pensions. Morality is not a part of the equation for them. Such individuals are simply committed to supporting their own personal paradigm at any expense to the planet or our futures. Such individuals are more than willing to serve the cancer that's consuming the world and pushing us all toward World War III. And now, very soon, the consequences for this type of societal behavior will be planetary omnicide. This is the course we are on, and if we remain on this course, in the geologic blink of an eye, our planet will be a lifeless rock drifting through the hostile environment of space. And this statement is not fear-mongering, not speculation, not conjecture, not hypothesis. It's an indisputable mathematical fact. I know how many people don't want to hear this over and over. But if you've heard it over and over and you're doing nothing still, aren't you a part of the problem as well? If you're going on about your life and not even attempting to find out what's going on, let alone do anything about it, then perhaps you need to hear it again until you choose to take action for the greater good. To all our brothers and sisters in the U.S. military, consider that for many decades you've been systematically lied to about countless issues. You and the U.S. public has consistently been fed completely spun, fabricated threats, carefully crafted deceptions designed to galvanize your support and assistance in furthering the agenda of the military-industrial complex. As I've stated in the past, though I salute the motive of many who join the military, a motive is not enough if that motive is not grounded in reality. We have to see reality clearly. If we are to behave honorably, that means we must examine the motives of the shadow government and the criminal central bankers that control it all. Protecting freedom and democracy is not a part of their equation. It never was. Those who control the levers of power are concerned with only one objective, the expansion of that power. That's reality. Those who have any regard for the truth need to open their eyes and take a good hard look at what actually is. To willfully remain in a manufactured false patriotism paradigm that's been spoon-fed to us by all those behind the curtain is to remain in denial. It's to remain in servitude to the psychopathic power brokers that are pushing all life on earth over the edge of the abyss from which there is no return. For those in the corporate media, those that are part of the power structure created weapon of mass deception and distraction, with few exceptions, your betrayal is the most egregious of all. It is you in the corporate media who have carried out the grand deception of the masses. It is you that have most completely facilitated the tyranny of those in power by using your skill and your control of information to galvanize the support of the masses for the power structure's paradigm of insanity that's so visible in the constructs of modern society. The military-industrial complex, the medical-industrial complex, the completely self-destructive societal model of perpetual consumption and expansion on a finite planet with finite resources with no regard for the incomprehensibly miraculous planet and environment that has allowed us to live in the first place, and about those in the halls and circles of academia. In how many ways do you bear the same burden of betrayal that the corporate media is responsible for? And I'm speaking to those who obediently serve the medical-industrial complex that has dished up for decades highly toxic and damaging vaccinations and decades of dangerous addictive drugs. And though I fully recognize and realize that Western medicine has brought many benefits, there are immense immoral issues happening in Western medicine that need to be faced. And to the academicians in the environmental sciences, how many of you are turning two blind eyes to actions and behavior of our government and countless corporations? How many of you are turning two blind eyes to unimaginably grave environmental threats like climate engineering and the highly toxic heavy metal and chemical fallout from it? Threats like Fukushima, the triple nuclear volcano that's contaminating the entire planet with no end in sight. Threats like the GMO and chemical assault on the entire web of life. Threats like the massive radio frequency and microwave transmissions bombarding the planet and permeating all life forms. How many threats will you look the other way on? And I know people in academia who are in many ways the most aggressively hiding from the truth, pretending that they're addressing the most important real issues while at the same time ignoring the most dire issues. And climate engineering is a prime example of that. How many environmentalists do we have that claim to be completely devoted to the safeguarding of the planet and yet ignoring the single greatest environmentally destructive factor of all. And that's saying a lot because human activity has decimated the planet. So many times when I talk about climate engineering, people seem to rephrase that in a way that sounds like I only recognize climate engineering as a source of damage to the planet, and that's absolutely not true. I lectured on global warming before I focused all on climate engineering because climate engineering is a superseding issue, and you can't legitimately discuss the climate without discussing climate engineering first, and yet I know countless people in the global warming and environmental community that refuse to even acknowledge this issue. Total hypocrisy. I hope that changes. And for such individuals, how do you justify your silence? Because you depend on the paycheck and pension that your obedience to the power structure provides? Is this your justification? Will your paycheck and pension matter when we're all dead and gone? When our planet's nothing more than a lifeless rock drifting through the empty expanses of space? And for the spiritual institutions that are pretending their scriptures and teachings allow them to sit on a pew and do nothing, while the miraculous creation that we were given is looted, plundered, and pillaged into a lifeless wasteland, I challenge you, any of you, in any spiritual institution, to show me exactly where your scripture allows you to take such an apathetic and irresponsible course of total inaction. Please show me. I've studied all the major religions, some extensively, and I can find no teachings that instruct us to do nothing. The do-nothing apathy. No. We're all required to be good stewards of the gift of life. We're all taught to be good stewards of the environment on which the gift of life depends. And what is it exactly that a particular biblical scripture states? Before you knew the truth, your sins were washed away. Now that you know and continue in your apathetic behavior, your sins remain. How can such a principle be denied or refuted? For any of us, in any scenario, in any position, in any form of employment, in any spiritual belief system, how can such a principle be denied? That once harsh and unpleasant realities are brought to our attention, we then bear a responsibility to do everything we can to correct the course of the ship, so to speak. We all bear a responsibility to the whole of which we're all a part. If this principle is forgotten or continues to be discarded by the majority, we'll all soon perish, as I've stated so many times in the past. This conclusion is not speculation, conjecture, or hypothesis. Rather, it's a mathematical certainty. If we remain on the current course, and how many I've known that have walked away from this fight for the greater good in the past. When the battle rages on longer than we anticipated or wished, does that give us a justification to abandon the front lines of the critical effort to salvage what is yet left of the web of life, of what is yet left of Earth's life support systems? Our society has been too well trained to believe in quick fixes and guaranteed results, trained to give up and abandon the most critical causes that may require our unconditional dedication to the whole, of which, as I have already stated, we are all a part. Why are we here if not to fully utilize our greatest gifts of reason, benevolence, and virtue? Gifts that require us to live up to our responsibility to do everything in our power to protect our children's future, which means we must do everything in our power to protect the miracle planet and the web of life on which our children's futures depend. Why are we here if not to fully commit ourselves to such an endeavor as this? The first and most important leap in the right direction we could collectively make is to wake the masses from their programmed apathy and denial. And we must all learn how to effectively and efficiently share credible data with individuals, groups, and organizations that would care if they only knew what was going on in our skies. On the top left of the home column of GeoEngineeringWatch.org, there are activist suggestion links. There are links to free downloadable color glossy flyers you can have printed locally. Very effective tool for waking those up around you. Much, much more effective than pointing at the sky and ranting. And if people wake up to climate engineering, If they understand that they've been subjected to this grand and lethal experiment without their knowledge or consent, they will open their eyes to other issues as well. It's imperative that we wake the masses. And all of us are needed in that effort. We all have the choice to be a part of the cure and not a part of the disease. We must never give up, never yield to the insanity. Going silently into the night is not an option. Make your voice heard in the battle for the greater good. Every day counts. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.